sore. Then a voice gently whispers, "Child, do not fear, God's providence is sure. God's providence is sure." Streams of pardon, fresh and free, healing fountain, oh, taste and see. Sweet rivers of mercy are beckoning me to leave the comforts of shore. Come wait in forgiveness, wash up with grace, and praise God evermore. Praise God forevermore.
Amazing grace shall always be my song of praise, for it was grace that bought my liberty. I do not know just why he came to love me so. He looked beyond my fault and saw my need. I shall forever lift my eyes to Calvary, to view the cross where Jesus died for me. How marvelous the grace that caught my falling soul. He looked beyond my fault and saw my need. Amazing grace, with joyful heart I sing of it. For by your grace you set my poor heart free. And all my days I'll never cease to sing your praise. For all the glory, Lord, belongs to thee. I shall forever lift my eyes to Calvary, to view the cross
Testing.
where Jesus died for me. How marvelous the grace that caught my falling soul. He looked beyond my fault and saw my need. He looked beyond my fault and saw my need. come.
Before the sun will stand, made faultless through the Lamb, believing hearts find promised grace. Salvation comes. Hear heaven's voices sing, their thunderous anthem rings through emerald courts and sapphire skies. Praises rise. All glory, wisdom, power, strength, thanks, and honor are to God, our King, who reigns on high forevermore. And there we'll find our home, our life before the throne. We'll honor Him in perfect song, where we belong. He'll wipe His tear-stained eyes, as thirst and hunger die. The Lamb becomes our shepherd king. We'll reign with Him. Hear heaven's voices sing, their thunderous anthem rings through the emerald courts and sapphire skies. Praises rise. All glory, wisdom, power, strength, thanks, and honor are to God, our King, who reigns on high
Glory to God our King You're the Word of God the Father, from before the world began. Every star and every planet has been fashioned by your hand. All creation holds together by the power of your voice. Let the skies declare your glory, let the land and seas rejoice. You're the author of creation, you're the Lord of every man, and your cry of love rings out across the lands. Yet you left the gaze of angels, came to seek and save the lost, and exchanged the joy of heaven for the anguish of a cross. With a prayer you fed the hungry, with a word you calmed the sea. Yet how silently you suffered, that the guilty may go free. You're the author of creation, you're the Lord of every man, and your cry of love rings out across the land. With a shout you rose victorious, wresting victory from the grave, and ascended into heaven, leading captives in your wake. Now you stand before the Father, interceding for your own. From each tribe and tongue and nation, you are leading sinners home. You're the author of across the land. You're the author of creation, you're the Lord of every man, and your cry of love rings out across the land. Across the land.
Father of lights, giver of gifts, there is no shadow in you. Author of life, fountain of grace, each morning your mercies are new. And you never change, and you never lie. Age to age you are the same. I will trust in you, all your faithfulness, for I know you never change. Father of love, source of all good, tower of strength and my shield. When you gave your son for those who rebel, your love for the world was revealed. And you never change, and you never lie. Age to age you are the same. I will trust in you, all your faithfulness, for I know you never change. Father of peace, help all the weak, though mountains fall into the sea. Though tempests may rage, the sun hide its face, your favor will rest upon me. And you never change, and you never lie. Age to age you are the same. I will trust in you, all your faithfulness, for I know you never change. And you never change, and you never lie. Age to age you are the same. I will trust in you, all your faithfulness, for I know you never change. For I know you never change. Lord, change my heart from deep within. Purify me once again. Renew my mind to love your truth. Make me more and more like Lord, cause my will to choose your ways in each temptation that I face, until your glory shining through. Make me more and more like you. More and more like you. More and more like you. Do whatever
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're delighted that you're here. You're in store for a great treat. I can't think of any other speaker that I would rather listen to than Jerry Frye. It'll be stimulating. It'll be just mind-blowing, really, in some respects, to consider the magnificent glory of God and the majesty of God in creation. And so let me, if you will, pray for us tonight as we begin, and then we'll turn things over to Arnie right away. Our Father, we are so blessed to gather this evening with one another to hear of your glory and your majesty as is shouted from your creation. And so, Lord, we pray that you would bless our evening, open our hearts and minds to the truth of your word and the glory of your creation, and certainly anoint Brother Jerry as he comes and speaks and shares with us this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.
My name is Arnie. I am the president of the Creation Science Society of Milwaukee. I'm grateful that everybody took the time to come tonight. Thank you to Brookside Baptist Church for hosting this event and partnering with us in presenting God's amazing creation and God's truth, the Bible. This is the last in our series of the 2013-2014 season lecture series. And our next lecture will be in September, although there's a possibility something might happen in the summer. Someone that might be available that would normally not be available, but that's all I'll tell you for now. If you are not on our email list or snail mail list, put your name, email address, or whatever you want us to have on the papers that are being passed around, the sign-up sheets, and or you can sign up in the back on the way out as well. So I guess that's all of the businessy kind of stuff. So I thank you again for coming, and I invite Kitty to come and introduce Mr. Frye.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kitty Foth-Regner. I'm a member of Brookside, and I'm also a member of the Creation Science Society of Milwaukee. And tonight I have the privilege, once again, of introducing one of America's finest creation science speakers to you, in Jerry Frye. Professionally, Jerry is a modest businessman. He's the president of the Benefit Services Group, which is an employee benefit organization that serves employers nationwide. He speaks all over the country on healthcare issues and risk management topics, and he's been involved in various legislative initiatives. I believe not the Affordable Care Act, though, but right? And he's been a featured healthcare speaker in settings from physician symposia to town hall meetings to Tea Party rallies. But for anyone here tonight, I'm sure it's Jerry's extracurricular activities that you're most interested in. He's been speaking on creation science topics for almost 20 years now, and he and his wife Natalie have taken these subjects all over the world, from Zambia to Guam and the Mariana Islands and some top secret places too. What Jerry teaches about the secular worldview, and we're going to hear about it tonight, is absolutely true. The fact is that for every clear proof that we have that this universe is the product of a loving creator, the evolutionists of the world have made up a just so story to explain it away and to take our eyes off the creator. Tonight, Jerry will provide us with an arsenal of powerful ammunition to use against these just so stories, and in the process, as we share this information, to pull some from the fire, as we are instructed to do in the Bible. I've been told that we can get, Randy is taping this, or DVDing this, or whatever you call it in this modern day, and if you would like to get a copy of the presentation so you can review all the information, because there's going to be a lot of it, you'll find these envelopes on the little information desk out in the lobby, and just fill it out so we know how to get a hold of you. Other than that, hang on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. Here is Jerry Frye.
after introductions like that, I'm almost afraid to open my mouth. Gonna wreck it. We're going to talk tonight, kind of a continuation. This is the 5th year in a row that they had me close up the season. So we're going to talk tonight about professing to be wise, they become fools. It's right out of Romans 1. But we're going to start right at the beginning. It's by faith that we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of the things which are visible. So the first thing is we do understand this by faith. And so there is faith in whatever you believe about origins. Whether you believe evolution or theistic evolution or creation, you're going to have faith in something, because there is a difference, I'm going to demonstrate it to you tonight, between observational science and historical science. There is a difference. They're both science, but they have a different weight and a different purpose. Some of you may have seen the debate, and I'll touch on it a couple of times, Bill Nye versus Ken Ham. And at the end, I'll talk to you about the Ark project that Answers in Genesis has going. The groundbreaking is May 1st. They will build a life-size Ark on a theme park down in Cincinnati, right off of I-75, 800 acres, right on I-75. It's absolutely prime land. Raised $73 million for phase 1, which is basically the Ark and the parking lots. So we're going to have to build some more, but we'll talk about that. That project probably would not have gotten off the ground had it not been for that debate. So there were plenty of Christians who, after seeing that, understood the battle we were in, and before that didn't really grasp the gravity of the situation. So I hope you come away with a new understanding tonight. There really are two very distinct and different stories about where we come from. The top one is basically what secular science teaches. About 15 billion years ago, there was an infinitesimally small dot that held all of the matter, antimatter, dark matter that exists today in an infinitesimally small spot, and it started expanding. There was some event, some cataclysm that caused it to start expanding. And that created our universe. Everything came from that. So understand right off the bat, Scripture says God created something from nothing, ex nihilo, something from nothing. Right off the bat, the Big Bang starts with the idea that everything always existed. They put the trait of eternalness on the universe itself, not on the Creator. The Creator doesn't say the universe is eternal, right? The universe is everlasting. It's going to last, but it hasn't always been here, not according to Scripture. So various time frames, 10 billion years ago, about 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth comes out. About 5 billion years ago, the sun was done. I don't understand this, though, because 3 years ago I used the same chart. It should be 5 billion and 3 years ago. But anyway, the first oceans were 3.8 billion years ago. Now, right off the bat, we have a problem, because Psalm 24 says that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and He created it in and on the seas. God tells us the seas were here first. So when we come down to Genesis 1, we have essentially the earth and then dry land, and then the sun, moon, stars, the sea creatures, the flying creatures, and ultimately land creatures and man. So you have these two very, very different stories. So let's look at what the secular science story is based on. It says in Psalm 14:1, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. They have all turned aside. They have altogether become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one," which is quoted in Romans 3:10 by Paul. The whole point here is God says the fool says there is no God. So let's talk about scientific materialism. That is the God of today's scientific culture. And basically it says it's the belief that the physical reality, nature, as we can see it and study it, and is made available in the natural sciences, is all that truly exists. Carl Sagan used to say, the cosmos is all that ever was, ever will be, or is. And essentially, The thinking atheist, that's a kind of an oxymoron to me, but the man is a result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. So that's essentially the starting point of materialism. There is no room for God. Okay? You have to have a natural or a materialistic rational explanation. So think about it. The fool in his heart says there is no God. That's where he starts. Proverbs says that the wisdom is, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So uniformitarian and presuppositions. Uniformitarianism is one of the principles that drives materialism. And essentially the rules are there's no beginning and there's no prospect of an end. In other words, the universe is eternal. It has cycles. Okay? Before the Big Bang, the theory of the universe was steady state. Went into those small infinitesimal ball and blows up again. Like a yo-yo, right? Hits the end, comes back down. That was the thought. Uniformity of process. Get this. Nothing has ever happened that can't be seen happening in the world today. So they're now limited to only processes they can observe today. So nothing they see can be explained in terms of processes that may have been different in the past. Well, we're told things were different in the past, right? God's done a lot of miraculous things, and certainly the flood, it was a one-time event. History is comprised of an effective, endless number of similar cycles. So you can see where Eastern mysticism gets some of its idea of reincarnation, deja vu. These kinds of concepts all come from that kind of a worldview thought. Uniformity of rate or gradualism. In other words, if I see something happening today at a certain rate, it's that rate that's used to presuppose how long it's taken to accomplish something. Okay, and so that's how you get the idea that the Grand Canyon is formed by a little bit of water in a lot of time, whereas the creationist has a belief that it's a lot of water in a little bit of time. Okay, and uniformity of state, non-progression. The world has always looked more or less like it does today. That actually, while they state that, they actually agree that the world did not look like that originally the world was a single continent. Both creationists and evolutionists believe that. And we've always had the same inputs and the results. So you get an idea that we have to use only natural items, and we have to use the things we can see in the present as the key to interpreting the past. What God tells us is he tells us about the past, and then he tells us about the future, and he says the key is what you do today. It is an entirely different focus of where you look and how you interpret things. So at the end of the day, what you want any scientific worldview to tell you is, where did the universe come from? Where does life come from? Where do species come from? And quite frankly, secular science has no answer to any of those. They have some stories, but they really don't have any answers. We, on the other hand, so that's where they're coming from. We, on the other hand, are coming from a worldview based on Genesis. During the debate, there is a book, okay? That's what we believe. So we're going to look at that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, so we believe that he did just that, and it's a literal story. Many of our seminaries today are teaching that that's an allegory. It's not true as literal history. Boy, you can't read that, can you? Sorry. But the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. This is the familiar passages from Psalm 19 that says, as you look into the heavens, doesn't matter where you are, you understand that God's glory is being displayed. And then here's that Psalm 24 we talked about. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. God's essentially telling us he did the water first. And on another presentation, we talked about the uniqueness of water. This is the only place in the solar system you can find water in its natural form, in the natural range on the planet. There is one other planet that has a flowing liquid. It's the moon Titan, and it's liquid methane. For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, who formed the earth and made it, who established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it to be inhabited. The earth was specifically formed to be inhabited. So as we talk about the examples we're going to talk about today, we're going to be way down into, the middle ear. We're going to talk about woodpeckers. We're going to talk about path integration in navigation of birds, things like that. But think about that. First, you have to have the earth. And the earth has to be an ecosystem that supports all of that. May you be blessed by the Lord who created the heaven or made the heaven and the earth. The heaven, even the heavens, are the Lord's, but the earth he has given to the children of men. So again, he didn't create it in vain. He created it to be inhabited, and he made man to have dominion. This is out of Job. But now ask the beasts, and they will teach you, and the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fish of the sea will explain to you. Who among all those or these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. So what God is doing is saying, look, you can look to the heavens, you can look anywhere on the earth, you can look at the animals that are created, you can look at any place. And he actually says in Romans 1 that man knows this innately because God's made it manifest to them, right? And they're without excuse. So we have these two very, very different stories. One creation, the other known as evolution. So let's see what the evolutionist thinks about God. And I really apologize for this statement, but you need to know that you cannot synthesize the secular worldview and science with the Bible. You can synthesize science, but you can't synthesize materialism, or the idea that they a priori exclude God. You cannot take that kind of science and synthesize it with the Bible like Logos does with Hugh Ross and whatnot. Here's what Richard Dawkins says. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, that means somebody who hates women, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, meaning not just killing children, killing your own children, pestilential, megalomaniacal, I can't even say some of these words, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. I can't even imagine how long it took him to put that list of adjectives together. But it's clear that these people have no place for God in their worldview. Why in the world would we take their interpretation of science and try to put it into our revelation from God to us about truth? Just be awful careful. Just be really careful. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. And like it, a time is coming when people will no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching. They will follow their own desires and will look for teachers who will tell them whatever their itching ears want to hear. They will reject the truths and chase after myths. Some of you may remember Nietzsche, right? He declared God was dead. This is on the back of the t-shirt. So, now we'll get to the matter at hand. That was all preamble. This is out of Romans 1:15. So as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to those who are in Rome also. This is Paul talking. He's talking about the purpose of his epistle. After this statement of purpose about preaching the gospel, he gives 3 or 4 applications to that. The first one is, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith, out of Habakkuk 2:4. And so that's the first 4, but there's 5 of them. And then he says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. For what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Here's the title. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like the corruptible man and the birds and four-footed animals and creepy things. So, God declares that we can look at the creation around us and we can discern his hand there. So one of the ways we would do that is to see design, right? You can tell if your child made something. We can tell if there's design in something. So if I look at a sand dune, that's easily natural forces. But it's pretty hard to say natural forces are going to put up these fairly elaborate sand castles. So there are techniques, there are tools, there are rules you can use to discern whether something is made by intelligence or if it happens by accident. So last year we talked about God said he made the earth to be inhabited. And I talked about, well, what would it look like if man made something so that we could inhabit a place that wasn't natural for us? Well, the space station. I don't think there's too many people who would try to insist that that happened by accident. Okay? It's clearly a designed thing with a very specific purpose. That's what God claims for the earth. We've used Mount Rushmore on many occasions. So if I were to give you the tools, the keys to the secular kingdom, and you could have all the earthquakes you wanted and all the sun and all the wind and sandstorms and rain, you just go ahead and have at it. How long would it take you to make that? Well, you'd never make that. That was made by a man or a series of men putting 60-foot carved faces into the side of a solid piece of granite. It took a man to do that. It took a design. It took the intelligent application of energy. Okay, so at the end of the day, you can see what you're looking at is something called specified complexity. It's not complex on its own. It's complex by design. Okay, so let me ask you something. Which is more complex? That picture of Abraham Lincoln on your right, or Abraham Lincoln the man? So if I designed the man like this and I took an x-ray and there he was, everybody would say, oh yeah, well that was made in a shop down the street, or the Swiss watchmaker made it, or something like that, right? But then you show them a real man with all the complexity, unbelievable mind-numbing complexity, and they say it happened by accident. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So Francis Crick, this is a guy who got the Nobel Prize, Watson and Crick in '53 for discovery of the double helix of DNA. Okay, and here's what he said. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but that it evolved. They have to constantly keep this in mind because when you look at it, it looks designed. Okay, the plain truth is everything around us looks designed. There's a good reason for that. It was designed. Okay. Our friend Richard Dawkins here, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So you need to think about it, right? They are denying a priori the idea that God could have had anything to do with this. So let's go into a specific example. Not only does God say he made the earth, not only does God say he made man, he specifically says, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Two of the most complex pieces of machinery outside the brain in the human body, the ear and the eye. And if you think about it, that's the way we intake most information. You can't share the glory of the Lord. You can't see the heavens. You can't see the world around you without the ear and the eye. So it's important. So let's talk about the human ear. And I know some of you may have heard some of this before. The outer ear, it's broken into the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The outer ear has the auricle. That's the piece that collects information. Didn't know it was going to run that fast on me. But then there's a canal. Okay, the canal has exactly a 3-to-1 ratio, which is precisely the size the canal needs to be to take the pressure waves. That's what sound waves are. There's a vibration on my vocal cord. It causes the molecule next to that to vibrate at the same rate, and it passes that right on down till it gets to your inner ear. The amplification of that pressure wave is optimal at human hearing ranges with a 3-to-1 canal tube. Okay, so it's perfectly sized. It's also perfectly sized by the way that pressure wave comes at you, what that slide is showing you, at 740 miles an hour. So it comes pretty good. It doesn't knock you over either. So the canal, though, is also made perfect so that babies, no matter how small their hands, can't get their fingers all the way in there. Every one of us would be deaf by the time, because we take our tympanic membrane, we take the eardrums out. So it's a blessing you can't do that. In addition, when we look at the canal itself, this part right here, this is the only place in the body, the human body, where the cells do not grow from the bottom up. In other words, this would be the exposed tissue, right? This is the canal. So normally these are the top cells right here, right along the membrane. And normally the cells would grow from the bottom up. That's how it grows in all other parts of your body, not here. Here, they grow from the eardrum out. So essentially, what you have is a conveyor belt of cells moving things away from the tympanic membrane to protect it. To make sure that things stick, you have wax in your ears. There's a whole series of very specially designed wax glands that are here, and basically only here, and they're designed to make this sticky. That's so bugs can't get in there and get at your tympanic membrane. That's so dirt gets trapped and ultimately gets a little cyst out. Takes a little while, takes about a week for that cell to grow from the tympanic membrane out. Takes a little while, but it's constantly doing it. Now, once in a while, some of us will collect too much, and we got to help get the wax out, right? That happens. But at the end of the day, that's the purpose of that. You don't want to put Q-tips in there. It's a really bad idea. Don't let kids get close to those, because that's the number one issue. The little arrows are showing you the direction of the cell growth. So the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum, looks pretty much like that. Very similar, actually, to what a blood cell looks like, much larger. So the sensitivity of the eardrum, this tympanic membrane can tell the difference between the bottom of that building and the top of the building. It can tell the difference in change in 1/30,000th of an inch. You stand on a piece of saran wrap, and we put electronic loads, or what am I trying to think? The things we attach. And the fact of the matter is, they can tell the difference. So your tympanic membrane is that sensitive. I'll show you why it has to be in a moment. But it's very, very sensitive to changes in pressure. It's sensitive to movements of just 1/10 the width of a hydrogen atom. I don't even know how they measure this stuff, okay? But the fact of the matter is, it is incredibly sensitive, and it has to be because of the job we ask it to do. So what happens is, that pressure wave I've sent to you, it's an air pressure wave. It's running at about 7,000 cycles a second. The wave itself, the frequency. And so when it hits that tympanic membrane, it will cause the tympanic membrane to literally cycle or vibrate 7,000 times a second. So you can see why it has to be so sensitive. So it starts vibrating. So the middle ear starts right there at the tympanic membrane, and there are 3 bones. They're called ossicles: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Sometimes the stirrup, the hammer, and the anvil. But the point here is, these are 3 bones, 3 very small bones. This is going to be the point of our discussion tonight, even though I'm going to take you through the whole process. I want to tell you where evolutionists tell us those bones come from. You'll love the story. So these 3 bones essentially vibrate on 2 hinges at 7,000 cycles a second, so that the stirrup ultimately will connect to the inner ear, and I'll take that journey on in a minute. I'm going to stay in the middle ear for just a bit. The middle ear is connected to the eustachian tube. The primary purpose of this is to equalize pressure on that very sensitive eardrum, right? You've all been in planes or underwater or something where you feel a difference. The point is that you're supposed to be able to equalize through there. The hearing sensitivity of this is the eardrum and the ossicles. the sensitivity is 1 million to 1. You have to fly the finest stereo equipment to get anywhere near that kind of sensitivity. At 4 kilohertz, that's 4,000 cycles a second, the eardrum responds to movements 1/10 the diameter of a hydrogen. And this stapes, that's this piece right here, that goes into the oval window, into the inner ear, which I'll talk about, is 0.3 inches long and weighs 1/10,000th of an ounce. This thing is unbelievably strong, because I'm going to challenge you with what else it has to do in a few moments. But it's 1/10,000th of an ounce. It is the lightest bone in the body by far, yet it has this incredible duty. So in the middle ear, what essentially happens is you can see the eardrum vibrates, these things move, and this stapes goes into the inner ear. It's the cochlea, goes through the oval window. I'll show you the cochlea better later, but that's to give you an idea of kind of what's happening. So this middle ear here serves 3 main purposes. The first purpose is to transfer energy. So it takes the pressure wave, which is received here, and the information from that pressure wave gets transmitted into these, and that gets transmitted into the water of the canals in the cochlea. The second thing that it does is it does impedance matching. So I've got air out here. This is a pressure wave in the air, and I'm sending it into the water. I'll tell you how we deal with that in a minute. But a pressure wave in air and a pressure wave in water are not compatible. So have any of you stood outside of a pool and somebody's under the pool and you try to talk to them? You can't hear it, right? They can't understand what you're saying. That's because there's an incompatibility between water and air. This actually changes that, and it's called impedance matching. It actually makes it possible for that to be understood. The third thing it does is it amplifies the signal by 30 times. And it does that by a simple Venturi effect. The size of the eardrum versus the size of the oval window creates leverage and amplifies that signal, because a stronger signal is needed in water than is needed in air to transmit that information. So it transfers energy, increases sounds by 30 decibels. The tendons, I haven't talked about those yet, but there's a stapedius and a tensor tympanzi. They're 2 ligaments. They're the smallest ligaments in the body, and they basically go right here and right here. And their purpose is to keep you from going absolutely stark raving mad. So I've now told you how sensitive the hearing is. Think about the noise that comes out of your mouth when you're chewing and goes up the eustachian tube. Something has to keep that from bothering the back of the tympanic membrane. And so that's what that's there for. The other one actually serves as a brake. So if you're in an incident, gunshot in particular, it'll actually freeze all of that, not allow it to move, because the pressure wave will be too great, it'll break. And so that's the problem we have in Iraq, right? With the IEDs. The pressure's too great, even with those safeguards in place. It doesn't hold. But these two are incredibly important. There's the tensor tympanzi right there, and the stapedius is here. Those are those 2 muscles of the middle ear. So now we go to the inner ear. That's called the cochlea, and these are the semicircular canals. That's your balance, right? So it's like a gyroscope. So I'm not going to talk about the semicircular canals tonight, but understand that the side I'm talking about is hearing. That's over here. But this works the same way, except you have one semicircular canal on each of the axes, X, Y, and Z, okay? All 3 planes. And it coordinates the information that comes from that for your balance. But for sound, what happens is this oval window, I'm going to come here, it's like a gyroscope. I guess I'm a little ahead of my material here. There's little hair cilia in here. I'm going to show you electron microscopes of those. There are 35,000 of them on the hearing side that actually will take the signal. And how that works, I'm going to move ahead here. There we go. Here's the canal. So it comes in here. This is the organ of corti, and this is a membrane. And so what happens is the water gets a signal from the stapedius coming in, and it creates a water wave. The water wave runs over this membrane, and the membrane actually tickles these hair follicles I was talking about. There they are. So here's the membrane, here's the hair follicles. On the end of the hair follicle, if I'm talking about my discussion at 7,000 cycles, it literally vibrates the top of that membrane 7,000 cycles a second, grabs the right hair, not just any hair. There's 35,000, and they're all frequency attenuated for all different frequencies. That's why when you get older, some of the hair fall away, and your hearing range gets smaller and smaller in humans. So anyway, the point is, on the other end, how the hearing works is it essentially turns that signal, which is still analog, into a digital signal by having an ion gate. So what happens is it literally opens up a gate allowing one electron through 7,000 times per second. So it's allowing exactly 7,000 electrons through an ion gate that opens up with a molecular spring. It's not even tissue. It's a series of atoms or molecules. And you have thousands of these in your ears. And it turns that. And then once you have that, you now have a digital signal which goes to a nerve center called a ganglia. The ganglia go up to the brain, and the brain has an unbelievable processing center to take all this information in. So it's very much like some of our military tools, right? We have looking glass. That's a military plane that flies over enemy space, grabs all the information from all of the sensors we have on the battlefield, puts it together, and sends back a map of where the enemy positions are, how to attack, etc. That's a similar kind of situation that the ganglia does. This is under an electron microscope. This is essentially the water canals. Here, the blue things there, that's the hair follicles that are being rubbed up against by the sensors. These are the nerves then coming back, and that'll feed up through that, in that piece, it'll feed up through into the ganglia. It's unbelievably complex. Unbelievably complex. So then we have to connect this to the brain. What I have done is send to the brain 7,000, I've sent essentially 7,000 ones or zeros. That's what you've done. Now the brain has to turn that into sound, into whatever it means, and cause the interpretation in your brain. So the idea is that these middle bones by themselves don't hear anything. They're just a method to transfer energy, to amplify the signal, and to do impedance matching. That's the purpose of the oscillator. You have to have this entire complex system to actually hear anything. So now I'm going to add to the complexity by a large margin. So now you're sitting in a restaurant. There's music playing over the ceiling speakers. Friend places an order with the waiter. Friend talking on the cell phone. Friend telling you about their day. Conversations at other tables. Noise from silverware. You get the idea. Police outside, etc. You understand. You're hearing all of them. You hear all of them. So that means that this tympanic membrane has to be sensitive enough to pick up different signals on different parts of the tympanic membrane and pass this information simultaneously through these three bones, which then pass it to the stirrup, right, into the cochlear, through the oval window, into the cochlea, and then that has to all be run through the ion gates to turn into a digital signal, and then your brain does the interpretation of what's important, what's not, how do you shut it off, all of that kind of stuff. So the other thing that happens about hearing, and it's pretty well proven fact, we have a mechanism in our brain that fills in blanks. And as you get older, you'll find you use that more and more, right? You don't hear everything. So while what I play, did you see that blank in the end zone? Well, the word is probably catch, but the brain actually fills that in. So if you think about it, what the brain is really doing is listening to an orchestra. Your two ears are gathering all kinds of data from all over the place. Unfortunately, it's not as organized as an orchestra. But I was looking for an example. So the idea is that the brain sifts through all of that, and then you have to determine what's important in that process. So I just want to praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I mean, when God says that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, it's just hard to explain really what he means. It's an understatement. Just the ear is an absolute miracle. So these are gray because these are not my slides. These come out of textbooks about where the middle ear came from. Now, they're not trying to talk about the whole ear. There's something called reductionism. So when I want to talk about a just so story, it's important that I take a piece of the story and define or describe that. And so this is where the middle ear came from. But I want you to think about something while I'm telling you this. Why should the middle ear exist at all? Because the middle ear by itself doesn't hear anything. Why should any kind of process, evolution or otherwise, drive towards creating those three elegant bones and that structure, that complicated structure? So there's a whole series of words they want you to know. I'm going to kind of skip through them, but if any of you buy the tape, you can have them. But there's similarity between species that results from hereditary traits from a common ancestor. And in homeoplasy, I want you to understand this is an important concept. Evolutionists are not asking you to believe that this happened once. It is absolutely critical you believe this happens all the time. It's called convergent evolution. And so things happen independently all the time. It's like 5 people in the world suddenly discovering radio at the same time. That would be convergent discovery. They're saying this happens, this doesn't just happen once. And it happens different for different species. Last year I gave you the example of cholinase, which is the enzyme for bioluminescence. There are 70 different molecules. So that means that bioluminescence in the deep sea had to occur 70 different times. And so that's what you're being asked to believe. There's something called therian and dental mandible. It's very important that you understand dentistry to understand where the middle ear came from. Because the middle ear bones in mammals are derived from bones in the dentary bone of thericids, and those are pre-mammalian reptiles. So essentially what they're saying is there was an angular, an articular, and a quadrate, these here, and they were in the jaw bones of a reptilian mammal, or a reptilian animal. That reptilian animal ultimately became an early mammal, and these 3 structures, which are dental jawbone structures, ultimately got pulled back over millions of years, and they became the middle ear bones in a human. They teach this. And how it happened was something called Meckel's cartilage. There's a cartilage that dried up in reptiles, according to the story, and that cartilage dragged these bones along. Now, how it made them impedance match exactly between pressure waves and water waves is kind of a mystery. And why it creates a 30 decibel increase, which is precisely what you need in order to match those 2 environments for impedance matching, it is a mystery. But nevertheless, that's where they say middle ear comes from. So that would be like me telling you a story about where transmissions come from, but there's no cars. Why in the world would anybody make transmissions without a car? So unless you have all the other parts, where is the plan coming from that you need to even develop these 3 bones? What do you need them for? Why would evolution choose that, right? Remember, these are supposed to be singularly beneficial accidents that happen by accident. So how does this happen over millions of years and you create a structure that's only useful with literally tens of other structures that are finely tuned to work together. That's called irreducible complexity. So the middle ear bones don't work without the outer ear, and don't work without the cochlea, which don't work without the ganglia, which doesn't work without the nerve center in the brain that does the communication. So typically what you'll see is they do morphology studies. That's form studies. So this is how the evolutionists teach. Remember, they believe that what they see today had to come from something that they find in the past. Well, what they see today are the live animals, right? The fauna around us. So they study them, and they study them well. And that study is worthwhile, very worthwhile. Then they'll find fossils, and they are now tasked with explaining how the structures came to be today out of the fossil information that they find, because the fossils they find in the present, right? We think of fossils as ancient. Fossils are always found in the present. And so you have to interpret what they were and how they got that way. And so they take that, and that's essentially what they do. And so this is all done substantially on morphology. And remember, when you're doing that, you're ignoring genetics, microbiology, right? You're ignoring cellular, molecular biology, all of that stuff. So those things are being completely ignored when you look at a morphology or just how things look. And so essentially, this is what the kind of stuff you see in the textbooks. I grabbed two similar examples. So this is what they look like, and this is, how the bones changed, etc. The transitional stages of evolution in the early thespids, I'm going to just read this so you get it straight. The quadrate, the angular, and the articular were directly connected to the dentary bone and the jaw hinge. These bones are essential for jaw movement. These bones were also utilized for crude hearing capabilities. This is fascinating to me. The bones don't do any hearing today. Why in the world do they assume that structures in fossils had hearing capabilities in the jawbone years ago? Because it makes the story better. I mean, I'm not saying that's it, but that's sure what it feels like to me. I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. So they look at the fossils and say where they came from, and they can see what happened here, and then a miracle occurs. And so, they accuse us of using miracles. The next stage of evolution came with separation of these bones in the dentiary. After the bones separated from the jaw, they formed the post-dentary rod. It is believed that these mammalian, and notice all the believed and we think and blah, 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 the mammalian middle ear bones evolved at least twice. This happened more than once. And it's believed that monotreme and therian ancestors evolved very similar, but 2 separate paths. So now we're to believe that the same thing happened a couple of times, but not only that, there were different paths. There's lots of ways to get middle ear bones. Well, it's easier to believe a story if there's lots of ways to get there. It's easier to believe in heaven if you can get there anyway. Right? This is another line of reasoning that's used commonly by evolutionists, and this is a morphology reason as well. This is essentially a breakdown of certain cartilages. Meckel's cartilage still exists in humans. And this is what it looks like in an embryo. And so as God creates us in the womb, and we start as 1 cell, then 2, then 4, then 8, etc., there's a stage at which the things line up this way. By the time you get to 20 weeks, you can see that those things have taken form. And so their argument is that nature, which after all, a baby is nature, nature takes these things and moves it around as needed. Not God programmed the cells to do this with all of the information, right? So they'll use this line of argument as well, that nature changes the actual function of some of the structures over the course of the development of the embryo. And I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. I think you get it. People seem to think that Christianity and evolution do or can go together, but I suggest that this is only possible for the intellectually schizophrenic. If he hadn't said it first, I would say it right now, okay? Biology theory does not require or allow any sort of divine guidance for the evolutionary process. In other words, he's saying we don't need God. Evolution is all the explanation we need. It provides all the facts we need. So in the debate, there's this discussion of historical science and observational science. And Bill Nye, as well as most of the rest of the secular world, and if you go on the internet, boy, they're fighting hard to say, look, there's no difference between these two. No difference at all. Science, the systematic study of the nature and behavior of the material and physical universe based on observation, experiment, and measurement, and the formulation of laws to describe these facts in general terms. That's what Bill Nye says. I'm a reasonable man, right? I'll follow the facts. The Lord says, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. So let's talk about a cochlear implant. My hearing doesn't work, but they can put a cochlear implant in me. I may get up to 21 leads. Remember, I have 35,000 hair. 21 leads means they can have some differentiation, but nowhere near the differentiation the natural ear could provide. Let me ask you, if you're doing a cochlear implant, assuming you have all the talent and all of that, does it matter whether the middle ear came from a reptile 1 million years ago, or if God created it? Does it make any difference? What matters? The only thing that matters is how does it work now? That's observational science. We can see how the inner ear works. We can see how the middle ear works. We can develop a cochlea that replaces the function that's damaged in the inner ear. That's observational science, and it is not dependent upon the historical science about how the ear got to be that way. Do you see the difference? So the inner ear, the point is that the scientist wants to say, because we can do cochlear implants, we're right about evolution. And it has nothing to do with it. Doctors are routinely asked, what part about your practice would you change if evolution weren't true? Nothing. Because they don't do their practice based on evolution. The practice is based on observational science today. How does your blood work? Do certain drugs work, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just want to remind us that we're all connected to this brain. It's easy to forget about that, but when you think about how complex the ear is just an information collection device. It still doesn't provide the context and the interpretation which comes through the brain. So the ear by itself, it's just an appendage. It's just a way to get information into the brain. As elegant as it is, it's just a tool. So what the creationist would say is God created this and we can study it and we can, work with it, etc. But the evolutionist needs to have a story. And so essentially, they'll usually ask you to believe in the big story, and then they'll start explaining pieces of it, like this, where the middle ear came from. The cochlea is another wild story about how the cochlea came to be. And then why the cochlea would bother to connect with the middle ear is a real mystery. But those are things that they're working on. They'll have new stories. So when we get to that, we want to talk about origin of species a little bit. Charles Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not have possibly formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So let's think about that middle ear. So somewhere between 1 million years ago, when Meckel's cartilage started moving up that reptile's jaw and pulling those 3 bones, do you think maybe there were some creatures that didn't have a fully functioning ear? Clearly, right? So you can't make that structure by small successive steps. There's no intermediate step when you have an irreducibly complex machine. So 747 is made up of about 800,000 parts, 2/3 of which are fasteners. You should be happy to know. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't work without all the parts. You got to have them all, right? You can't use some of the parts. That's an irreducibly complex system. So what we were talking about was right here in an organ. And I was talking about a very small part of an organ. And so the evolutionist story is very reductionist because it does not, like I say, take into account the atomic, the molecular, the cellular, the tissue level, the full organ, then the organism, the habitat, population, etc., and I can finally get out to the cosmos. Science, as God has revealed it, information as God has revealed it, it's called granularity. You can take God's truth and apply it from the cosmos down to the atom. And it fits all the way through. And you'll find many, many of the evolutionist stories fit only in this tiny little space. And the reason for that is they have to guess, right? They do. Now, we don't know how God did it, but that's the battle that's going on. And the idea that we can take the approach that evolutionists take and synthesize that with our Bible, and that should inform how we interpret, especially verses in Genesis, is just not proper. It's not right. It's not the right approach to Scripture. All the evidence available in the biological sciences supports the core proposition of traditional natural theology, that the cosmos is a specifically designed whole with life and mankind as its fundamental goal and purpose, a whole in which all facets of reality, from the size of galaxies to the thermal capacity of water, have their meaning and explanation in this central fact, the idea of creation. That's by Michael Denton. I'm not sure if he's saved or not, but he's certainly written some useful stuff for us from the scientific point of view. He's the one who wrote a biological black box. Fred Hoyle, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from such facts seem to me to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion beyond question. So he's kind of saying common sense, right? But unfortunately, common sense isn't so common. God says, everyone who is called by my name, whom I have created for my glory, I have formed him. Yes, I have made him. It's in Scripture all over. God says he made us, and he's going to hold us accountable to that truth. I want to bring one other point about the human body. It's worth $5 when you're dead. The materials, that's what it's made of right there. You can go to any chemical store and go get it. And he makes the human body out of that. It's worth about $5 today. Too bad there's not more gold in there, huh? I'm going to talk about the woodpecker. All things woodpecker. I have a pileated woodpecker on the left, the red-headed woodpecker down on the bottom, and the Lewis woodpecker on the top. That's the range for the red-headed woodpecker. You can see these are substantially North American birds. That's the Lewis woodpecker, and that happens to be the pileated woodpecker. We'll be talking tonight mostly about the pileated, but all woodpeckers share many of these characteristics. And these characteristics that I'm going to talk about tonight are the design features in a woodpecker that are different than a lark. They're the same size, have the same ranges, but they're not made the same at all. They don't have the same function, and they don't have the same needs. Claws, tail, beak, brain, skull, tongue, and muscles in the woodpecker are all specifically designed to handle the task that God's given the woodpecker. And I know that a woodpecker is a pest, but you will have to admire them after this. They're really made in a special way. Most birds have a foot configuration of 3 and 1, okay? That's an ideal foot configuration for roosting. So if I'm roosting on something and I'm going to hold onto a line or a branch or a limb, 3 and 1 is perfect. The woodpecker, 2 and 2. The reason is woodpeckers are almost never roosting. They're holding onto the side of the tree for life, right? They're on the side and they're holding on, and so their claws are very different. So they have 2 in each direction, and you can look at them, they're pretty nasty looking. They can hold on to wood pretty good. And woodpeckers go after healthy wood, not just rotted wood. And the woodpecker tail, very, very different from most birds. They have these undertails, these center tail wings, the undertails here. You can see these are 4 very stiff, specially made tail feathers that go farther than the other tail feathers. So you'll notice woodpeckers, and the reason, I should tell you what the reason is. The reason is because the woodpecker actually is like a tripod on the tree. So it's those 2 legs, and then the tail with those extra long, stiff middle ones can anchor itself to the tree, which is going to be important when we get to the top of the bird. And so it's like a tripod, gives it much more stability for the task it's going to do. Interestingly enough, you won't find woodpeckers trying to move down a tree. Those tail feathers would dig in and make it very difficult. Woodpeckers always move up. So they'll land on a lower side of a tree and move up. Okay, and these tails are made of a special material, and this is the inside of the material. And in a lark, most of the bone structure is round and has a certain size. In the woodpecker, they're flat, and there are about 3 times as many struts inside. So the strength of a woodpecker's beak, its skull is 10 times stronger than a lark. The reason the woodpecker has to have this kind of strength is as a woodpecker is striking the tree at maybe 8 times a minute, it has deceleration forces of 1,000 times gravity. So in our fighter planes, when we put people in these special suits and all that, they might go up 8, 9, 10 Gs, no more. We think that probably the most a human has ever survived is 100 G. That would be in one of these race cars with all the stuff built around the person, and they're not sure, but they estimate it's possible that they had those kinds of forces on them. The woodpecker, every time it strikes the tree, has deceleration forces of 1,000 times the force of gravity. If the woodpecker didn't have a nictating membrane, a special membrane in its eye, and if it didn't close its eyes, that's right, it closes its eyes before it hits, the eyeballs would pop right out of its head. Every time. By the way, the woodpecker almost never misses, but its eyes are closed. And this nictating membrane is translucent. Can't really see through it. Doesn't need to. That's not the point. It's to protect the eyeball in the case, right? And it's to provide shock absorber. But the falcon has a nictating membrane that you can see through so that the falcon can dive at 247 miles an hour and see in that kind of air. So just to give you an idea of some of the special adaptations that various birds have. There's a spongy frame up here along the head, and it's like the shock absorber. They did CT scans of the bird's head and neck and found that it has 4 structures that absorb mechanical shock. So it has this hard but elastic beak. The beak, by the way, isn't directly aligned. The lower beak is slightly to the left and smaller. It also doesn't have the same tensile strength, so it will deflect a little bit on the hit. All of these things are designed to take some of that shock and move it away from the head. A sinewy, springy, tongue-supporting structure that extends behind the skull called the hyoid. That's a bone, and that bone actually extends back, and the tongue follows it all the way back. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's an area of spongy bone in its skull. It's this special skull structure. And the way the skull and the cerebral spinal fluid interact suppress vibration. So the woodpecker has much less space between the skull and the brain to allow spinal fluid. Very little spinal fluid can get in there, as opposed to our problem, right? We can get fluid on the brain between there. They don't get that. The other thing that helps them is their tongue. The woodpecker tongue, as you can see, will go outside of the mouth by 12 inches. It goes underneath. This is not outside the bird. This is skin and everything removed. But it moves under here, under the Adam's apple kind of area, comes all the way up over the head and connects inside one side of the nostril. It doesn't connect to the nostril directly, it's right next to it. The point is, that's an enormous shock absorber for the bird. So that's the tongue right there that's kind of being outlined. So a really interesting question is, how did it get there? Okay, nothing else has a tongue like that. And the point of that tongue is to actually get down into the tree and catch the bugs. So let's talk about that tongue a little bit. First off, it wraps around their head. It's covered in a sticky saliva, call it a glue solvent, so that when it sticks its tongue out, the solvent is applied outside the mouth. Because if the solvent was applied in the mouth, the woodpecker would not open its mouth again. It's that good. So it's applied as the tongue moves out, grabs the bug. The tongue is also barbed. So it's like a fishing lure. Okay, it's got barbs on it. Catches those bugs. The tongue has a hearing mechanism on it so that it can hear the bugs moving. So the woodpecker doesn't have to hear it, right? The woodpecker's got its tongue and it's wandering around inside this tree in the hole that it dug. And so it has a hearing device. It's called the Herpes corpuscle. And so it has all these tools to actually get the bug. Brings the bug up. As soon as it gets close to the mouth, creates a solvent that dissolves the glue, right? And then the woodpecker can eat this bug. So the woodpecker hit their times 20 times a second. 20 times a second they're banging that thing. 1,000 times the force of gravity deceleration forces. It has extra muscles that are extra thick in the neck and the skull, also in the legs. All of them built different than other birds because they have a different thing. The bone, it has this extra eyelid called that nictitating membrane. And when pecking, again, 1,000 times the force of gravity. It has thick, pate-like, spongy bones spaced close together. They're called trabeculae. And the woodpecker skulls are 10 times stronger than the comparable larks, but the beak is the same strength. The importance of that is it is important that when it hits, that the beak deflects, but the skull does not. That protects the brain, right? It deflects some of the energy. So I can't go into the physics, but that's why it's designed that way. So it turns out that most of our shock absorbers are built on those four mechanisms that woodpeckers are. So most of our shock absorbers use those techniques to, in fact, create an easier ride for us. Because the ride is all about deceleration forces. When you hit the potholes, we got some epic ones by us, you know. I'm just saying that's what's happening, and you need a shock absorber to absorb some of that. So most shock absorber technology actually comes off of imitating the techniques used in the creation that God had of the woodpecker. So at the end of the day, we have a bird who is specially designed to stand on the side of trees and go after bugs in healthy wood, has specially designed beak, tongue, head, has special muscles in the neck, in the feet area here, and in the tail, has specially designed tail feathers. I neglected to tell you that the outside tail feathers are made smaller so they don't give the woodpecker difficulty in moving side to side around the tree, because you'll see the woodpecker move laterally around the tree. So everything is designed perfectly to make that happen. So how do you explain the evolution of all of these features at one time? So do they evolve one at a time? Which one evolves first? How does natural selection make those kinds of choices? And what about the woodpecker that doesn't evolve some of those things? Would they survive? Perhaps not, I don't know. So the point is, this is what the textbooks say. Through natural selection, so first off, a priori, the assumption is natural selection is the mechanism that accounts for the woodpecker. No explanation whatsoever. Woodpeckers have developed their own amazing nanofabrication and self-assembly capabilities. And understand the woodpeckers are doing this themselves, okay? In their cranial bone structure over millions of years of evolution. I don't know about you, but there was nothing explanatory there. They're declaratory statements. Many other interesting adaptations are seen in different species of woodpeckers. Some species have modified joints between certain bones, it's true. As much as muscles which contract to absorb the shock of the hammering, strong neck and tail feathers, a chisel-like bill, or other hammering adaptations which are seen. So you'll see that word, adaptation, adaptation, adaptation. It's all natural selection. It's just assumed to be true. This is what's teaching about where the woodpecker came from. According to an article by Rusty Ryan, Anatomy and Evolution of the Woodpecker's Tongue, the interesting anatomical structures of the woodpecker's tongues, due to mutations and natural selection, can be reasoned through the analysis of their hyoid skeleton. So, back to Meckel's cartilage in the inner ear. In a pre-mammalian reptile, a cartilage moved, dragged 3 bones with it, and created the middle ear ossicles. What they're saying here is the hyoid bone, we all have them, in the case of the woodpecker, looks different than the hyoid bone in many other birds. And their argument is that that hyoid bone grew back and grew bilateral. It's on both sides, it splits, and it essentially dragged the tongue with it. Now, why the tongue kept growing out the mouth, I don't know. It should have, sucked way back in, but that's the explanation. And that's the kind of stuff being taught. So these are some more statements of the same. The woodpecker's skeleton shows several special adaptations. The skull is particularly sturdy to withstand the blows, etc. The woodpecker is superbly adapted for chipping away wood and picking out insects, etc., etc. The feathers in the woodpecker's tail are especially stiff, and the outermost feathers are reduced in size, allowing the tail to act as a prop. Mostly declaratory statements. No explanation, no real discussion of how natural selection did it, only a declaration that it's so. So these are the kinds of pictures that are in the science textbooks, which I find fascinating, because do you see that woodpecker evolving from anything? Looks to me like they're all woodpeckers. So let's go on to our last subject. Oh yeah, I got you for a little while yet. I was told I could keep you until the conjunction was done. You know there's a conjunction tonight, right? Mars, Earth, and the Sun. So if you look out, you'll see Mars, then all you gotta do is run around halfway around the world, look the other way, you'll see the sun. It's true. There is a conjunction. We're perfectly aligned tonight. But I'm not gonna keep you that long. How do they think we navigate? So bird navigation, something that fascinated me, and basically something I didn't get to finish last year as the technology betrayed us. Some of you may remember. So I thought I'd go back to it. So I wanted to talk about migratory birds. And there's birds that migrate all over the world. And I could go on to other things. Fish migrate, butterflies migrate. Lots of things migrate. They all use different mechanisms. I'm going to talk about bird migration tonight. Here's another example. These happen to all be birds that migrate out of Alaska. And you can see the various winter routes out of Alaska. So there are 13 major routes coming out of Alaska. And you can see some of them are 5,000-mile routes. Falcons migrate to every place but Antarctica and New Zealand. I have no idea why New Zealand got left out. But they migrate everywhere. So how in the world does a bird that's never been there find its way there? This happens to be a picture of the migratory routes and some actual pictures of the birds that go through Israel in the Middle East. My wife and I were privileged to be there in the last 2 weeks. And in the spring and in the fall, they have 500 million birds migrate through Israel. It's absolutely stunning. And I promised my wife if we had time, I'd tell you a little bit about the quails, the European quails, so I will. European quails are mentioned in Numbers. This is the animal that made the people of God sick, right? Because they complained. And so there are 3 paths of European quails through, there's the eastern route, the middle route, and then the western route, in fact, does go through Israel. And it does go down through the Rift Valley. The Rift Valley is west of the Jordan River, so it's actually in Jordan. That's exactly where the children of Israel would have been wandering in the wilderness. There is something called quail poison. Any of you ever heard of it? It's called corturism. Apparently, quails, only when they migrate, become poisonous. And on the eastern route, they're poisonous in the spring coming down. On the Nile route, they're poisonous on the route going up in the fall. They're poisonous in both directions on the route in Israel. But there has never been any demonstrated poisoning in the 20th century anyway, on the route where the children of Israel would have been. But the point is that quails apparently eat various plants, and they hold the poison. The poison is durable. That means I can kill the bird, freeze it, pickle it, cook it, whatever. 4 months later, I can still get poisoned. Okay, so the poison is stable. It's not required. It doesn't have to be part of the quail, but the quail carries it. The quail is not harmed by the poison. Okay, so this is a little bit like the acquired defense mechanism that the monarch butterfly gets from milkweed. Okay, the caterpillars eat the milkweed, goes through the metamorphosis, still has some of the chemical from that diet. So anyway, I threw it in. But there's about 500 million birds that fly through here. There's a picture. It's pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, I really looked into this. I really wanted to tell you about this, but I couldn't find it. And that is the Israeli Air Force has all kinds of countermeasures because they can't fly. Can't fly. There's certain times of the year their jets are at great danger. Commercial aircraft paths are changed, etc. So anyway, lots of birds. So how do birds navigate? Well, first off, birds don't see the same way we do. They can see in the ultralight spectrum, ultraviolet. There's actually 2 ultraviolet spectrums. Some birds can see in both. So this is what you and I would see. This is what a bird would see. So the world looks different to the birds. When an animal leaves a urine track or leaves any kind of organic track, in ultraviolet you can see that from about 1,000 feet up, if your eyes are okay. So that means that animals actually get tracked by birds. They can see where they were. Okay? So birds have some amazing abilities. It's not a good thing to be a small mammal or rodent. This is the difference between ultraviolet 1 and ultraviolet 2. This is a cockatiel. Most of us have seen those. This is what they look like in the 2 UV ranges. So birds have that ability first off. That becomes part of it. Another part is polarized light. Most of us have or have seen sunglasses. What sunglasses do is they deal with the wave properties of light. They have particle properties too, but this is the wave property. So when the wave is moving like this, we can use a picket fence as an analogy. This is a phased wave because the picket fences are set up this way, and the picket fences, or your eyes, don't change how you see. The wave is unchanged because it goes through the fences. But what if I turn the fence and it blocks it a little bit? You can see it changes the wave. The difference between filtered or polarized light, and unpolarized or filtered. So the bird can see this naturally, does not need sunglasses. This is what our sunglasses do, takes this out. That's how it does it. It filters polarized light. Birds can see polarized light. How they do it is turn their head sideways. Okay, polarized light is perpendicular to the earth, and so by telling where the polarization is at, they can tell their angle of attitude compared to the earth. Now, how the bird knows that is another matter. But the fact of the matter is birds can do this and determine their angle to the Earth. Then many of them have some ability to deal with the Earth's magnetic field. And most of you know that magnetic north is not equal to our North Pole, right? It's hundreds of miles from there. But we do throw off magnetic waves or energy waves that look similar to this, moving from north to south, or south to north, actually. So if you look inside of the bird has a mechanism to determine, to see that wave. We can't see that wave, but they can. In their right eye, and only their right eye, in the upper half, they have some special molecules. They're made of a carotenoid, a porphyrin, and a fullerene. A fullerene is like a buckyball. It's a hexane ball, 6-sided carbon. It's important that carotenoids are what makes your leaves orange in the fall. It's inside the leaves. When the chlorophyll disappears, your leaves that have a lot of carotenoids in them are going to be orange or yellowish. In the middle, porphyrin is a molecule that holds these two together. This string, this complex molecule, is polarized. That means it carries a charge. So it allows an electron to move freely from the top of the molecule to the bottom of the molecule. The bird can measure how fast that charge moves because that charge is sensitive to the relative position of the bird to the magnetic field of the Earth. So as they move around the Earth, the magnetic field changes the position and whatnot, and so the bird can tell roughly where it's at on the Earth. This works in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Doesn't matter. The only place it doesn't work too good is the equator, when you're right in the middle. But other than that, a bird can basically tell where they're at in relation to north, south, and the equator based on this. Now, if that wasn't difficult enough, there are other birds, this is a European robin, that actually have another mechanism that does a similar thing. And this is in their eyes. It's called a magnetoreceptor cells in the retina of the eye. And they have flavin and tryptophan radicals. These are charged particles in the eye, so it's a similar mechanism. But it also can use this mechanism to tell where it's at in relation to the magnetic field of the Earth. Is this sounding like maybe this happened by accident? Okay. So this brings us to the real mystery, and that's something called path integration. So how does a bird actually get there? Is magnetic information enough? Probably not. Turns out that birds have sun compasses, star compasses, odor compasses. They have the magnetic map and the magnetic compass. So if I told you that you were at north 50, west 820, that'd be an interesting piece of information. It's better than knowing nothing. But if you don't have the key, right? If you don't have the whole map, you don't know where that is. Well, that's the problem the bird has. It's now collected some information, and it tells it what its attitude and altitude in relation to the magnetic field of the Earth is. But in order to put that in context, it needs to know all the possibilities, all of them. It needs to have a full map. So to give you an example, I hope nobody's against war, but the best example I could find was a Tomahawk cruise missile. How does it get to where we're sending it? Because once we launch it, we don't have to do anything. It's going to go right down that door. You've all seen the pictures, right? It goes right into the door of the building we're aiming at. How does it do that? Well, it's an incredibly complex machine. But essentially what it does is it uses GPS guidance. It will use GPS guidance for about 3 minutes. That's it. GPS can be jammed by anybody in their backyard. GPS is very easy to jam. So it moves immediately to something called TERCOM, which is pre-recorded contour map of the terrain that's compared to measurements made by the flight on an onboard radar altimeter. So it's elaborate Google-style Earth maps of the terrain are compared to data on an onboard radar system that's constantly bouncing signals off the ground below in order to measure changes in elevation. In other words, it's doing contour mapping, it's checking against historical Google Maps of the Earth and matching it and figuring out where it's at. Well, okay, it's got the information to bounce the radar off to figure out where it's at right now, but in order to put that in context, it has to go back to the library, right? And it has to match that. And that's not all it does. TERCOM is then combined with another method of navigation known as inertial navigation system, and that's essentially dead reckoning. I know I want to end up here, and I was here, so basically I have to keep going that way. It's nothing more complicated than that. But inertial dead reckoning will keep you from making a lot of mistakes, false positives from the other feedback systems. And then the last thing is modern cruise missiles have another system called a digital scene matching area correlation. This is for the portion where they actually come in home. Before we hit those targets, we use our satellites and take pictures of the path. We upload them to the missile, and the missile just follows it right in. Well, that's essentially what the bird's doing, except who put all that information in the bird's head? Where did it all come from? These systems are just information gathering. They're like the ear, okay? But it takes the brain. Somewhere there has to be context and interpretation. And so birds, this is a simultaneous location and mapping problem. These are all special kinds of cell. This is a suggested model of biological path integration in order to solve the simultaneous location and mapping problem. This thing could go for pages to show you how complex this is when we try to figure out how birds do this. Evolutionists are not trying to explain migration. The only explanation you'll hear is that these birds were fleeing from an environmental threat. So the weather was bad, the predators were bad, the food disappeared. I mean, that's what they say. But I don't know how you explain billions of birds migrating all over the earth consistently for as long as we know in recorded history. And they're not all running away from predators. They're not running away from bad weather. They're not any of those things. Sometimes it's nothing more than mating. So at the end of the day, this bird is actually, when you say bird brain, you really ought to be careful about that. They are incredibly well designed. So to kind of summarize again, to go back to Job, ask the beasts and they will teach you, and the birds of the air they will tell you. Speak to the earth, it will teach you, and the fish of the sea will explain to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, in whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind? I mean, we just went through a couple of bird examples. It would have been nice if I would have used all birds, but the inner ear one just really, I had to share it. This was said by John Adams a couple of hundred years ago, that men find ways to persuade themselves to believe any absurdity, to submit to any prostitution rather than forego their wishes and desires. Their reason becomes at last an eloquent advocate on the side of their passions, and they bring themselves to believe that black is white and that vice is virtue, that folly is wisdom and eternity a moment. Just couldn't say it any better than that. So a fool finds no satisfaction in trying to understand, for he'd rather express his own opinion. That's actually out of Proverbs. This is Robert Jastrow. I don't think Robert was saved. He's dead. He was a very influential scientist for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory during NASA's heydays. And he says, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. And probably the best thing to end on. Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world. One of my favorite quotes from Ken, it's just unbelievable when an unbeliever has to believe to be an unbeliever. So I thought I would end with just a few moments about this ARC project most of you have heard about. Groundbreaking is May 1st. We expect it to be up in 2016. There'll probably be additions to the park over the next few years. They're expecting 1.2 million visitors a year. And so they're expecting a 50% increase at the Creation Museum itself. This is the site, and we are standing in the middle of the ark. You see those stakes? See how far down they go? It's 510 feet long. It'll be 6 stories tall. They're going to put it on a 12-foot pedestal so you can walk under it. And when you walk in, it'll hold 8,000 people and all the exhibits. I don't think we're going to hear the ark wasn't big enough. And this Noah film has nothing to do with the story in the Bible, with the exception of a few names and places, etc. This is what the park is designed to look like. This will have the fountains of the deep break up every 3 o'clock. That's the plan. So they're trying to find a way to make the wall go up about 200 feet in the air, kind of like the Bellagio fountains if you've been to Vegas, seen those, throws the water in the air. And they're going to have a March of the Animals before that every day, give a gospel presentation with the idea that there was plenty of room on the ark. The door was open. The animals were on the ark for 7 days before God closed that door. And Noah was preaching salvation. Anybody that comes through the door, there's plenty of room. Plenty of room. And so they're going to give a gospel message every day. That's the intention of the park. And this is just a scale model of what the inside will look like. That's Pat Marsh. He was the principal designer of Dollywood and a whole series of others. Secular theme parks. So they have some really good people working on it. So I just ask you to pray for that project as it goes forward. The creation evolution debate was a huge catalyst for getting some more Christians on board. And I think it's going to be an exciting project. So I just thank you for your attention tonight. I'm done. You want to do questions or anything? You want to do a couple questions or something?
Oh, that'd be great, yeah. And by the way, if anybody wants to buy DVDs of Jerry's talks from the last 3 years, we have some copies of them out at our tables. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, please.
Who do you think won the debate between Ken Ham and I?
Well, it depends how you want me to answer that question, but in my view, Ken Ham won hands down, but it's not Ken Ham. The kingdom won. The gospel of Jesus Christ was presented in a clear way a number of times to other people who would never have seen it. And the other thing is, it was made very clear that that it's a faith. Ken didn't go there, and I appreciate why he didn't. But it really is faith about whether you're going to believe in evolution. I mean, think of the stories they have to believe to get there, right? It's like Adam said, there's no limit to what they'll do to justify seeking after their own desires, etc. But the other thing that's become clear to me over the time, and I've spent a part of my life trying to argue people into the kingdom, it doesn't work. We're supposed to pray for them. We're supposed to feel sorry for them because they're blind. Right? They just can't see the spiritual truth. The things of God aren't clear to them. And so the idea of excluding God a priori from their work doesn't seem foreign to them. And so it says that a fool in his heart says there is no God. And then in Romans it says that professing to be wise, they become fools. How can they become anything but that? If they exclude God from their work, how can their work produce anything but foolishness? It can't. And so I think we're supposed to pity them. It's taken God a long time to get me to that spot, right? Because I get angry and, what are you, I mean, you're putting this poison in people's heads and all that, but at the end of the day, that we're just called to testify to the truth. And that's why I'm excited about the ARC project. It's just this thing that the secular world cannot stand. They will do everything they can to stop it. I should take you through the bond raising project. It's unbelievable what they did to try to stop it. And God's people still came in, got it done. It just sticks in their craw. Yeah.
As far as the bones in the inner ear and development in the embryo and in the womb, at what stage those bones develop, and why do they stop developing at that point in time? And for that matter, all bones, if you will, they all grow to a certain size and they all stop.
Yeah, well, the bones, and you're talking about the middle ear. The middle ear bones are fine. And so once they reach their maturity, which is about 8 months, they never grow anymore. They're the same till the day you die. And if you think about it, once they get finely tuned, think about their function. It's to be an impedance matcher from pressure waves on air to pressure waves in water. It's to be that fine transfer of information. So it's got to be very particular. Think of all those sounds, and it's transferring all that energy through cycles per second. I mean, thousands of cycles per second, and maybe 100 voices at the same time. I mean, it's actually unbelievable if you think about it. I actually can't imagine how those bones work. So the fact of the matter is, once they reach a certain size, that's their intended, and that's why they don't grow anymore. And so most of the things that don't grow in your life anymore are located in your head. Yeah.
If the Earth is only 6,000 years old or so, how do you explain, like stars and the speed of light, where they say it has to be billions, because that, light travels at 783,000 miles a second, and it would take, way more than 6,000 years. How do you explain it?
Yeah, the question is distance starlight, and so if we're right about the distance of the stars, then they're certainly farther away than 6,000 light years, right? They're much farther away than that. So the light should have taken a lot longer to get there. I've heard a couple of explanations. I don't find them satisfactory. The first is that God could have created the starlight in process. Well, the evolutionist says, well, God's deceiving us, making it look like it's older than it is. But Adam was created an adult, so I don't know why he couldn't do that. And so that's out there. I actually prefer the explanation that the Old Testament gives us. 13 times it says that God spread out the heavens. So if he put them in a spot, and then he simply, however you would do this, spread out the universe. I mean, I can't imagine such power, such ability. But it would explain a lot of things, because actually the most difficult thing to explain is not the distant starlight, but rather colliding galaxies. So if galaxies have been out there all that time and God put them in place, how come some of them have collided within 6,000 years? And the answer there again would be the idea of spreading out. If it's like a tablecloth and they think space is curved and it's like that, the fact of the matter is you could account for any of that. Humphreys has a much more scientific explanation, Russell Humphreys, and it has to do with energy across the horizon on white holes. I can't tell you any more than that. So they have some explanations. Distant starlight's a problem for everybody, actually. Even the evolutionists, it's a problem for. The reason is because when you use the Doppler redshifts, there's stars that are right next to each other that are supposed to be the same distance, and they can't be. And we can tell by other methods on a quasar how far it is away, because it's a radio signal as well as a light signal. And in fact, they have the same thing, the same Doppler shift, but they don't have the same radio shift, and they should. And so there's lots of things we don't know about space, just like there's lots of things we don't know about our own oceans, right? Very little we know. Yeah, Bernie.
It's interesting that most scientists would refer to Einstein's
Yeah, I would agree. I think the biggest problem that the Big Bang has right now is something called dark matter and dark energy. Maybe I shouldn't say the biggest, one of the most notable. The reason we know that this is a problem is when you look at the solar system, there's something called angular momentum that comes from gravity, right? And so the closer you get to the source of gravity, the faster you're going to rotate. So we all see this in these little gravity wells where the kids throw the coin in, or flushing the toilet for that matter, right? The Coriolis down the middle. That's true in our galaxy. So the farther out you go, the longer it takes to orbit, et cetera, et cetera. That's not true of galaxies themselves. So it turns out, it shocked everybody, but the stars on the outside wings, the Milky Way, for instance, has 6 arms. The stars on the outside are moving at the same speed as the stars on the inside. Well, the only way that can happen, if gravity's right and if Einstein's theory of special relativity is right, the only way that can happen is if there's an enormous source of gravity towards the outside. Well, you can't see that. That's called dark matter. So it has to exist or our science is no good, okay? And this is the same science that's allowing us to put spacecraft, out to Pluto and stuff like that to take pictures. So, I mean, it's not totally wrong. It's just not complete, probably. But the problem is that dark matter wasn't quite enough, so they had to create dark energy for a series of reasons. But the reason is dark energy is more concentrated. E equals mc squared, right? The amount of energy, dark energy, is matter squared. So you need a lot of matter, a lot of dark matter to create a certain force. You need less energy to create the same force. And so right now, the state of affairs, what we're teaching our kids, is that the visible universe, all that stuff we see out there, billions of stars, right? You look in the hole in the Big Dipper. You look in the Dipper, through that hole, 100 billion galaxies. Through that hole. Just use the space telescope, 10 days, deep space, it's called a deep space picture, or go towards the Abeli, the star attractor, it's towards the center of our galaxy, and you'll find, it's just unbelievable. It's just galaxies and galaxies and galaxies. So anyway, the only way to account for all of that is to create this dark matter, dark energy, and what we see, all that stuff, is less than 5% of the matter that they need to create the energy that's causing things to hold together, galaxies in particular. So now when you read Hebrews and it says, in him we consist, he holds all things together. I'll tell you, I get a chill when I read those things. He's literally holding the universe together. And if you read Revelation, he says, the universe is just going to fly away when he's ready for judgment. All he has to do is let go. So I don't know what the answer to those things is. All I know is if you follow the standard formulas and the standard science, they eventually come across these problems. And then they create what Jason Lyle refers to, and I've affectionately stolen, is rescue devices. So here we have comets, right? Comets shouldn't exist if the universe or the solar system is old. Comets generally have a lifespan less than 10,000 years. They get near a sun, they really get tore up, and they're just not going to come around very long. So it's pretty well accepted you can't have long-term comets or short-term comets more than 10,000 years. Well, then where are they coming from? Where are all these comets coming from? Well, they've created something called the Oort cloud, O-O-R-T, right? Now, the Oort cloud is so large that random collisions create new comets. Okay, it's so large that it's got so many of these space pieces going out there that it does this, but it is so small that we can't find it. Okay? And it's a difficult thing, and it's supposed to be somewhere outside. It's supposed to be like a second, we have a group of asteroids and trans-Neptunian objects between Jupiter and Mars. There's quite a bit. Between the rocky planets, the 4 inner rocky planets, and the 3 now, outer planets, and our Neptune friend or Pluto friend, they're out past that, but there's an asteroid belt there that's quite substantial, but that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about something similar to that, but has to be on the edge of the solar system. Now we can find Pluto, which is not very big, size of Rhode Island, but we can't find this thing, which has to be absolutely gargantuan to have enough particles in it to create the number of comets we see through random collisions. So you'll find all kinds of those kinds of rescue devices that are made. Other questions? Yeah.
How long ago did they discover that flight of the birds?
Last 15 years.
I've never heard of it.
No, last 15 years. And flight integration is, it's become the cause célèbre in many of the artificial intelligence schools, those things, because the argument is we should be able to recreate that. And then as we started to do that, we found out just how complex it is, and the birds just do it, willy-nilly. Yeah.
How much wood is it gonna take to build that ark?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but the wood's coming from some northern forests in Scandinavia. They've already commissioned the wood, and the builders are Amish from Shipshewana area in Indiana, and they built the largest wooden structure. It's called the Shipshewana Market, which was a commercial venture. It failed, by the way, not the building, but the business. But they're going to build it, and it's there's no nails or anything. It's all pegs and putting it together. So the wood was about $3 million. They think 2016, you know how construction goes. And I truly expect they're going to get sued for hundreds of reasons and for no reason at all. People are going to do whatever they can to slow this down. Yeah.
Do you know of any organization that is trying to bring creation to like the public school system or Bible-based curriculum to the public school system? Because this stuff is good, and why are we teaching our kids evolution?
Well, we're teaching our kids evolution because the schools get paid to do that. They're told they're going to do that because that's truth. As a matter of fact, it will be a surprise to me if I don't have to go to jail in the next 10 years. People like me are abusing our children. You need to hear them. They're accusing anybody that believes in creationism and would actually teach their children. They're talking in social service agencies about taking children away from parents who homeschool their kids this way. So maybe it was wrong to point it at me. I just mean people who are willing to stand up and say this at some point must be silenced. You heard about the CEO of Mozilla last week, right? Mozilla is a web browser that many people use. He was a founder. He's been there 15, 20 years. He was named the CEO, and somebody found out that 4 years ago, he funded $1,000 towards an organization that wanted to defend marriage between a man and a woman, right, Doma? He is out. He's out of his company. The board of directors has thrown him out, and they have made clear in Silicon Valley that anybody that believes in that is not welcome in the business. And now there's a movement afoot because 35,000 people donated to that organization. They want to go after every one of them and see if they can get them jumped out of their job. This is going to become a very difficult country. They have taken God out. Oh, yeah.
One of the main points of Common Core is to teach the children that what their parents are telling them regarding God, the creation, and things is a myth, and they must not believe it.
Yep, no, they're going to get militant about it.
Yeah. If I went to school with this on, I would have to, if I was a student, I had to go home, take it off. I would be suspended.
So we just need to be making sure that we're funding people like ACLJ and Matt Staver and other people like that that are fighting for Christian civil liberties. That stuff matters. When they make you take nativities out of the town square and they make you take crosses off the hill and that stuff, it matters. So unfortunately, Christians are too nice sometimes. And we let ourselves get pushed into a corner, and then when we have to fight, it's really a fight. And that's where we're at. I don't think it's ever too late. God decides to give us the victory, we'll have it. But some of us have to stand up, and more of us have to try and take a more active role. And clearly, the first thing that all of us can do is our children and grandchildren. You know, do what you can to share the truth with them, provide them resources, etc. And, you know, then you try to move the battle out from that sphere. But you certainly have to deal with the people in your sphere first. Yeah.
You talked about bird brains. We had a pet bird for a few years. Birds really are not terribly intelligent.
Agreed.
I would liken them more to like a pocket calculator, where they've got like a bunch of pre-programmed functions, but they're pretty much limited to the pre-programmed functions.
I would agree with that, actually. But then the interesting issue is, how does all that pre-programming evolve? Where does the information come from? And where does the design about what the program should be and what the desired action should be, right? So, and then you have to build the bird itself with the stimulus gathering information and the ability to process that against whatever you want. Now, we've traditionally called that instinct, right? The bird does that by instinct. It's a little more complicated than that. Yeah.
I guess a follow-on to that, one of the analogies I use is, well, if you look at a pocket calculator, it's mainly, it's got a silicon microchip in it and a few other chemicals and some petrochemicals around it. You could pretty much build that out of sand and oil. And so basically, if evolution is true, you ought to see pocket calculators laying all over the Middle East.
Yeah, I understand. I could take the same argument, though, and say, since it's all oil and chemicals, there's no reason it couldn't accidentally fall together either. And that they'll come up with a just so story that says that. But you're right, because at the end of the day, those ossicles in the middle ear, they're made out of that dust, that $5 worth of dust, just like everything else in our body. It's a miracle. That's all there is to it. Yep.
The Smithsonian magazine, which came out a couple of months ago, had a very interesting article on the migration of the sandhill crane and all of its mating and that. It was very interesting. But at the beginning of the article, it said it's the only bird that survived from 14 million years ago. Well, then what happened? How do all those other birds come in?
14 million, they think the sandhill crane was around? Okay. Well, the Smithsonian is an active anti-Christian, anti-creation organization. Very active. So it's a free museum. So all your kids can go to the Smithsonian for free, right? Yep.
I don't know for sure if you can answer this. I've read this some time back and I don't quite understand it all. But anyway, the evolutionists tell us that the Earth was a ball of gases and that it slowly cooled down over millions of years. And the bedrock of our planet basically is granite, from what I understand and read. And that there's some halos in there that were formed in 180 seconds, and they could only be formed it can't be done while it's hot because the halos wouldn't develop. Do you know what I'm trying to say or anything about it?
Yeah, they're radium halo crystals, and you can't, the fact that they exist would seem to indicate that the Earth coalesced instantly through creation rather than over long periods of time. God also says that the center of the Earth is never going to be discovered by humans, right? If you can search out the foundations And if you can count the number of stars, I will throw off my seed, Israel. That's in Jeremiah. God says, if you can do that, I'll throw him off. And you know he's not going to throw off the seed of Israel. So the fact is, we'll never find it. So I think I'm getting the hook. So thank you very much.